Picture this. You're walking through the dark velvet halls of a once mighty palace, the scent of roses and decay still clinging to its tapestries, and you hear a faint echo, a woman's laughter, regal and sharp, floating just beyond reach. But the voice is cracked. And the face? Not the alabaster perfection painted in portraits, but something else, something hidden beneath layers of white lead and crimson rouge. A mask to shield the world from what time had done. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story, the drama, and the slow decay of Elizabeth of England, the Virgin Queen whom time, despite her efforts, could not forgive. And today we unmask the woman trapped beneath the image. In the 16th century, few events caused as much upheaval as the birth of a mere baby, as was the case with Elizabeth Tudor. On September 7, 1533, between 3 and 4 in the afternoon at Greenwich Palace, a girl destined for the crown was born. This was Elizabeth, daughter of King Henry VIII, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Her birth, however, was a bitter blow to her parents, who had desperately hoped for a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. All the royal physicians and astrologers, save one, had predicted a boy, and the French king had even been asked to be the godfather. The disappointment was so palpable that the planned jousting tournaments were cancelled, and the letters announcing the joyful event were hurriedly altered, adding an S to the word prince to make it princess. Elizabeth's first breath came with the sour stench of failure. She was given her own household at 3 months old. She was paraded through London in royal splendour. But none of that mattered, because 2.5 years later, everything fell apart. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, the ambitious queen who had captivated Henry VIII, lost favour after a string of miscarriages. In May 1536, she was executed, accused of adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king. The charges were likely false. It didn't matter. The axe fell, the crown moved on, and Elizabeth, not yet 3, was declared illegitimate. Can you imagine being a toddler whose mother is publicly beheaded, and then erased from history as if she never mattered? Her half-sister Mary, already a victim of her own mother's fall, refused to recognize Elizabeth's title. The household collapsed into chaos. Some say Anne Boleyn, before her death, ordered the servants to slap Mary if she didn't treat Elizabeth properly. Royal vengeance etched into nursery routines. And so, from the very beginning, Elizabeth grew up with 2 lessons carved into her bones. Power is conditional, and love does not protect you. In a world where being a girl was a liability and royal favour could vanish with a signature, Elizabeth did the only thing that made sense. She studied, she learned, she adapted. By 12, she could translate classical texts, write elegant Latin, and debate theological questions. Her mind was a weapon, her tongue a shield. But the court is a dangerous place for brilliant girls, especially beautiful ones, especially when men with power see both. Imagine being 14, bright, curious, and trapped in a house where power smells like perfume and danger wears a charming smile. After her father's death in 1547, Elizabeth moved into the household of his widow, Catherine Parr, the 6th and final queen of Henry VIII. But Catherine was no ordinary stepmother. She was clever, devout, politically astute, and newly remarried. Her husband, Thomas Seymour, a man described as handsome, impulsive, and dangerously ambitious. The kind of man who smiles too long, who touches too easily, who mistakes silence for consent. And Elizabeth, she was still a child. It began with laughter, light teasing, harmless games, they called it. But the truth was much darker. He would enter her room in his nightshirt at dawn. He would tickle her until she squealed, slap her on the backside while servants looked away. Sometimes Catherine joined in, once even holding Elizabeth while Seymour cut her morning gown to shreds, blade slicing through black fabric like a joke. But it wasn't funny, it was grooming. It was the slow poisoning of a girl's sense of safety. Today, we would call it abuse. But back then, it was just courtly play. Can you imagine what it does to a teenage girl when the adults in her life laugh off her discomfort? When the lines between propriety and pleasure blur so completely that shame feels like something you're not allowed to name? Eventually, the whispers grew too loud. In 1548, Elizabeth was sent away under the polite fiction of preserving Catherine's health. But the truth was obvious. She had become a liability, a scandal waiting to explode. They never saw each other again. Soon after, Catherine Parr died in childbirth, and Thomas Seymour, newly widowed, turned his attention back to Elizabeth, this time with open intentions. He wanted to marry her, but the court wasn't blind. They saw through the charm. They saw ambition, manipulation, danger. Seymour was arrested for conspiracy against the crown. And Elizabeth? She was interrogated for hours, over and over. They wanted her to crack, to confess, to implicate herself. But she didn't. The girl who had once cried in silence behind closed doors had become something else. Steel beneath silk. She protected her servants, shielded her dignity, held her ground. She said nothing she didn't mean to say. But the toll was real. Her health collapsed. She lost weight. Her skin turned sallow. Headaches and stomach pains became constant companions. And yet, she survived. Seymour was executed in March 1549. And Elizabeth, barely 15, had already endured more than most women twice her age. She had watched desire curdle into danger. She had learned that the most charming men could carry knives behind their backs. And she had learned something else, something that would shape her entire reign. Never let them know your fear. Never let them see you bleed. She was 19 when death came calling again. Not with a sword, not with poison, but with suspicion, that ancient hound that never stops pacing in the halls of power. It was 1554, and her half-sister Mary, newly crowned Queen of England, was watching everyone. Watching her. Elizabeth was the Protestant shadow trailing behind a Catholic throne. When Thomas Wyatt's rebellion erupted, an uprising against Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain, Elizabeth's name was whispered in every corridor. No proof, no letters, no plans, just fear. And that was enough. Mary ordered her arrest. Imagine what it feels like to be summoned for a friendly visit and end up staring down the iron gate of the Tower of London, the same gate where your mother entered and never left. Elizabeth begged them to let her in through a different entrance, not the traitor's gate, not the place soaked in ghosts. They refused. She stepped off the boat and onto the stone steps where so many had prayed their last prayers. And she said, "Here lands as true a subject being prisoner as ever landed at these stairs. Before thee, O God, I speak it, having no friend but thee alone." They led her to a cold, echoing room in the bell tower. It wasn't a dungeon, not in appearance. But prison doesn't need chains when the walls themselves whisper betrayal. She spent 2 months there. 2 months of silence and terror, of listening for footsteps that might mean death, of wondering which servant might be the one to slip poison into her wine. Her health faltered again, the headaches returned, her weight dropped. The bright mind behind her eyes kept spinning, but the fear never left. She knew Mary hated her, and Mary had already executed Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen. A cousin, a threat, a girl with royal blood and a Protestant faith. She was beheaded. Why not Elizabeth? The only reason she survived was politics. Philip of Spain, the man Mary was desperate to marry, didn't want a scandal. Killing Elizabeth would make him deeply unpopular in Protestant England. So Philip asked for mercy, and Mary, desperate to please him, agreed. On May 19th, the exact date Anne Boleyn had died 18 years earlier, Elizabeth was released. Not freed, just relocated. To Woodstock, a hunting lodge far from court, isolated, watched, a royal bird in a slightly bigger cage. Can you picture it? The Virgin Queen, not yet a queen, pacing dusty halls, watched by guards, whispering prayers into pillows soaked with sweat. Every knock at the door, a thunderclap of dread, every glance over the shoulder, a question she could never ask out loud. Will they come for me tomorrow? When the crown finally came to her, it wasn't with trumpets and roses. It came with ghosts. In 1558, Mary died, and Elizabeth, the girl who had danced with death in the Tower, became Queen of England. But she knew better than anyone that the crown is not a salvation. It's a disguise. From the moment the coronation ring slid onto her finger, Elizabeth Tudor became a performance, a myth in the making. She understood with terrifying clarity what the world needed her to be, and what it would do to her if she failed. So she invented someone else, The Virgin Queen. Not a woman, not a widow, not a ruler surrounded by hungry men, a symbol, a saint, an idea. It was genius, it was armor, and it came at a terrible cost. For years the image worked. Elizabeth stood alone, unmarried, untouchable. She spoke with the voice of a king. She ruled with the poise of a goddess, and the people adored her. But symbols cannot bleed, and bodies do. On October 10th, 1562, the illusion cracked. She took a bath, an act considered dangerous at the time, as warm water was thought to open the body to infection. Within hours, she collapsed with fever. She lost her voice. Her skin began to flush and boil. It was smallpox, a death sentence in the 16th century, disfiguring, brutal, swift. The pustules hadn't yet appeared, and that terrified her physicians even more. They thought she would die before the disease had time to erupt. Panic tore through the court. There was no heir, no succession plan, no clarity. Would Mary, Queen of Scots, take the throne? Would England fall to Catholic rule again? Would civil war ignite? And in the middle of this firestorm lay Elizabeth, unconscious, shivering, lips too cracked to pray. Then came a man named Dr. Burcott, a German physician summoned in desperation by her cousin Lord Hunsdon. He wrapped the Queen in red flannel and placed her by the fire, a strange, almost mystical cure. And somehow, she lived. She opened her eyes, spoke, refused to name an heir. Instead, she requested her beloved Robert Dudley be made protector of the realm. The court flinched, but it didn't matter. Elizabeth was back. By October 25th, she was taking counsel again. The smallpox receded, but something fundamental had changed. She had survived, but the mirror no longer recognized her. Smallpox hadn't scarred her face as badly as feared, but the damage was done. Her hair had thinned, patches of baldness appeared. Her once fair skin now required a thick layer of white lead paint to appear smooth and youthful. She began wearing wigs, heavy cosmetics, rouge over powder, mercury-based creams that cracked and peeled with time. Each morning became a ritual of concealment. Each portrait was retouched, idealized, cleansed of time. But behind the paint and pearls was a woman who had seen her own death, and now feared it in every breath. She had faced disease not as a monarch, but as a woman terrified of being seen as weak. And from that moment on, she vowed they would never see her fade, not if she could help it. The Virgin Queen had become a ghost in her own skin. Years passed, wars were won, Armada repelled. England praised her as Gloriana, the fairy queen, untouched by age or sorrow. But the portraits lied, because the woman behind the myth was crumbling. By the 1580s, Elizabeth's daily rituals resembled acts of preservation more than preparation. The layers of white makeup, thick, toxic, lead-based, weren't just cosmetic. They were defensive armor, designed not to enhance, but to hide. Hide the blotches, the sagging skin, the lesions from years of illness and treatment. She wore wigs not out of fashion, but out of necessity. Beneath the jeweled coif, her scalp was bald in patches, smallpox having stolen the vibrant red hair that once defined her. And then there were the teeth, rotten, blackened, many gone entirely. The Queen loved sweets, hated dentists, and suffered the consequences. Foreign ambassadors noted that when she spoke quickly, she was nearly impossible to understand. Her breath was foul, her words garbled by the gaps in her mouth. And still, she smiled. Or rather, she showed her mask. Can you imagine the strength it takes to walk into court every morning knowing your body is betraying you? To let painters immortalize you as a radiant goddess while your own reflection makes you flinch? But Elizabeth was no fool. She understood better than anyone that a woman in power could not afford to look mortal. So she commissioned paintings with strict instructions. Do not age her. Do not change her. Let every canvas tell the same story. Ageless, flawless, untouchable. The iconography became surreal. She was portrayed as Astrea, the virgin star maiden, as Belphoebe, the moonlit warrior, as Gloriana, the fairy queen. Images so divine they bordered on fantasy. And yet she walked with pain. Her joints ached, her back curved, her hands trembled when not hidden beneath lace gloves. The contrast was unbearable. The myth on the wall, radiant, defiant, and the woman below it, exhausted by the weight of living up to her own legend. She became a creature of ritual, of control, obsessive about privacy, furious when her routines were interrupted. Each day had to be perfect, or as perfect as illusion could make it. Because she knew, the second the court smelled weakness, they'd begin circling, and so she stood taller, spoke louder, laughed longer, even when her body screamed for rest. Because in the world Elizabeth ruled, vanity wasn't vanity at all. It was survival. By the final years of her life, Elizabeth Tudor was no longer just wearing a mask. She was trapped inside it. The woman who once commanded armies with a glance now stood for hours on end, refusing to sit, refusing to sleep, refusing even to lie down, as if motion itself could keep death at bay. She was nearly 70. Her body was failing. But her will, that legendary, terrible will, remained sharp as the jewels on her fingers. She had buried so many. Robert Dudley, her beloved companion, dead. His stepson, the Earl of Essex, executed by her own hand. Catherine Carey, her niece and lifelong confidant, gone, and with each loss a piece of her was carved away. They say when Catherine died in 1603, something in the Queen broke beyond repair. She fell into a deep, strange silence, refused her meals, refused medicine, refused company. For days she just stood, motionless, in the middle of her chambers, draped in black, eyes fixed on nothing. Can you picture that? A queen surrounded by velvet and gold, standing in the center of it all like a statue of mourning. Silent, still, unmoving for 15 hours at a time. Her ladies whispered of visions, of cards found nailed to her chair, of mutterings and tears and memories that replayed like ghosts. And when they begged her to rest, to lie down, to sleep, to save what strength she had left, she snapped, "Must is not a word to use to princes. Little man," she told her minister, "little man, you know I must die, and that makes you bold." But even as her words trembled, her grip on ceremony remained. She kept the illusion intact, refused to be seen without her paint, her wigs, her gowns. Until the very end, she clung to the ritual, because when the ritual ended, so would she. Eventually, her strength gave out. She collapsed into bed, her body exhausted, her mind frayed. The Archbishop of Canterbury was called to her side. He prayed aloud, invoking her immortal soul. She said nothing, not because she refused, but because she couldn't. Her lips had gone still. Her body, that royal fortress she had spent decades fortifying with cosmetics and myth, was finally crumbling. They say she asked for her coronation ring to be removed, the symbol of her marriage to England. But the flesh had grown over it. They had to cut it off. That detail alone speaks volumes. The girl who once wore power like a second skin was now being peeled away from the throne, piece by piece. And yet even then, they needed her one last time. Her ministers gathered at her bedside and asked, "Who should succeed you?" She couldn't speak. So she raised her hand and drew a slow, deliberate circle around her head, a crown, James of Scotland. And with that, the myth gave its final breath. Elizabeth died at Richmond Palace in the early hours of March 24, 1603. They say she passed like a falling apple, quiet, mild, as if surrendering at last to the thing she'd fought her entire life, being mortal. When Elizabeth Tudor died, the world did not immediately mourn the woman. It mourned the idea of her. On April 28, 1603, more than a month after her death, her body was carried through London in a grand funeral procession. The streets overflowed with people. Every rooftop, every window, every gutter held onlookers. Silent, still, watching. But the queen they watched pass wasn't really Elizabeth. It was her effigy, a sculpted image laid atop the coffin. Pale, regal, untouched by time. A mask of eternal youth for a woman who had died nearly toothless, bald and broken. When the people saw that lifeless figure, pristine, flawless, they wept. Not for the person, for the illusion. And yet, even in death, her body betrayed the story. One of her ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth Southwell, claimed that after burial, the Queen's corpse exploded, yes, exploded, from the gases of decomposition trapped beneath all those paints and poisons. A grotesque, symbolic ending for a woman who spent her life hiding every imperfection behind powder and lead. The truth? We don't know if it's real. Southwell was Catholic and had every reason to paint Elizabeth's death in horror. But the story endures. Why? Because it feels true. Because it fits. A queen who made herself into marble could not escape the rot beneath the surface. They buried her first in the vault of her grandparents, but 4 years later they moved her to share a tomb with her half-sister Mary, the woman she feared, the woman who imprisoned her, and on their shared tombstone is an inscription in Latin, "Consorts in realm and tomb, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of resurrection." Hope of resurrection, how painfully ironic. In life they were rivals, divided by religion, ideology and legacy. And now, side by side, they lie together, embalmed in silence, dressed for eternity. Elizabeth's reign was remembered for centuries as a golden age. Gloriana, the virgin savior of Protestant England, the woman who crushed the Spanish Armada, the mother of empire. But look deeper. Look past the stained glass and the sonnets. What you'll find is not just a queen, but a woman.